Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I thought I'd do something useful and I wanted to show you how to use Photoshop and how I use it to make sprites and pixel art in general. So for this video, all you're gonna need is an installation of Photoshop itself. If you've never used it before, don't fret. It's not going to be something too difficult or scary. And I know that Photoshop might seem that way when you first open it up. There's a lot of options, but as most of us, you're gonna be using only what you need for the purposes of your work. And if you want to explore other options and learn more about Photoshop, I'm sure there are other tutorials that can teach you how to do that. However, today I'm just going to be focusing on the very basics, which you need to do what I do, which is make sprites and pixel art, like I said. And as you can see on the screen, these are the topics that I'll be covering today. And the list might seem a bit heavy, but I assure you, most of these are going to be less than 1 minute of talk, and it's very straightforward. If you've ever used any image editing tool before, you're going to find most of this to be pretty easy to grasp. If not, then this will be a fun adventure, nothing too complicated, and hopefully you'll use this as a first step to making some awesome art. Okay, so let's get into it. So now that you have Photoshop open, you can press File and New or Control N to create a new document. We're gonna enter our own dimensions here manually, but you could also pick one of these pre-made ones. However, let's just go with something like 32 times 32. You want to make sure that the unit of measurement is pixels, not centimeters, because that can come as a default, and we're not making centimeter art, we're making pixel art, so let's go with that. And here we go, we have a new document open. So first thing first, we want to make sure that you have all the tools that I'll be talking about visible on your screen. Sometimes when you install Photoshop, they don't come open by default. So you're gonna want to make sure that you have the layers window, which you can see on the right-hand side, and that you have the toolbar, which you can see on the left-hand side. However, if you do not, you can go to Window and Options, Tools. Make sure that both of these are turned on. And then we can go Layers here to open the Layers window. And you should be able to see the same things then as I do. So what do we have here? It's a blank document of the size which we specified, and usually when you're making sprites, they tend to be smaller. Of course, you can make the document as large as you need to, but for most intents and purposes of our, so to speak, profession, we use small canvas because the sprites themselves are small. However, I will show you as well how to use a larger canvas and then slice sprites out of it instead of doing each sprite in a single small document. But for now, let's make do with this one, and you'll take a look at the layers window and you'll see that we have a single layer here called background, and it has this little padlock here, which means the layer is locked. You cannot move or touch its settings and stuff like that. So we want to remove that lock by clicking it, and now it should be fine. And now we can use Alt and the mouse wheel to zoom in quickly. And this should be your go-to method for zooming in on smaller canvases, because sometimes when you're working with an image, you want to make sure that it looks fine both when enlarged and when you're looking at it in its original size. For that, you can also use these very handy shortcuts, which are 100%, which means it will display in its original size. And you can also use Fit on Screen, which will fit the entire thing onto the available area on your screen. You can, of course, check the shortcuts for these functions here on the side. So it's Control 0 and Control 1. You can as well go to Edit and keyboard shortcuts, and change the shortcuts for any function which you want in the entire software. So that's pretty handy. If you're used to something else from a different software, you can just remap your keys to be how you want them to be. So let's have a look at the toolbar, shall we, and see what kind of useful stuff we can find here. So first of all, I have this tool here selected, which is the Move tool. And one thing you'll notice about the toolbar is that you have multiple options kind of concealed behind a single button. And if you want to see all of the options in that category, you can right click on the option and it will show you everything else that's concealed there. So don't let this confuse you. If I'm talking about some tool here and you don't see it on your screen, that might be because your toolbar is set up differently, and you can just right click and find the other tool which I'm talking about. And you can also, if you want to later, go to edit and go to the toolbar, and now you can edit which options are shown and in which order. So let's start drawing something, all right? And the first thing I want to explain before we do that is how layers work. So if you are not familiar with layers, what are layers?
Would you prefer a nature metaphor or a sexual metaphor? You're going to want to hear the sexual metaphor.
Was that not the...
All life is layers.
But to show you from a more practical standpoint, let's take the Move tool and make sure that the Auto Select option is ticked here, and it says layer, not group, which means that when you use the Move tool to click on something, it will automatically select the layer on which that content is located. And if I now click on this white color, it's gonna select background. I can also click on the little eye icon here and hide the contents of this layer. So if I hide the background, you can see that something else happens. Now we have this sort of checkerboard pattern. And what is this thing? So this is a way of Photoshop representing emptiness, like total emptiness. There is nothing here, absolutely nothing. And you can modify how this is displayed by going to Edit and Preferences and Transparency and Gamut. And now you can select your preferred way of displaying this thing in these options. For me, it's just a white/gray checkerboard. So if I turn the layer back on, I can see the white color again. But now that I have the Move tool selected, I can move this thing around. Now it's not very visible because both the checkerboard behind it and the white background, like this square, are both white. But let's use another tool, for example, this Paint Bucket tool here, to recolor the white background into another color. And you can choose colors by going to this square here, clicking on it, and it will bring up a menu in which you can pick a color. So I'm going to take something blue like this, and there we go. So now you know what the Move tool is and what the Paint Bucket tool is. We will go a little bit more in detail about the Paint Bucket later, but for now, let's take a more neutral color. So let's pick something around here, like in the middle, and let's do that. And we want to draw on top of this background. We don't want to draw inside of it, because if we do that, our drawing will be embedded in this gray color, and we don't want that. Usually when we're making sprites and art for games in general, we don't want any background for it. We just want the sprite itself to be an isolated piece of work. And how we do that is by making sure that everything else except the contents of our sprite is transparent. So that means this should be the background of your sprite, aka there should be nothing behind it. Like this is total emptiness. And to make sure that I'm not painting on the background, I'm going to create a new layer by clicking on this button here, which is a button for creating a new layer. And there it is, layer number 1. We can rename it to whatever we want, like drawing. And we could also right click on this eye here and we're going to get a menu of colors. So what these colors are, they are just markers which help you identify layers by some measure that you've defined for yourself. For example, I might want to use the red color for layers which I will not need later in production, but I need them for something now. So that might tell me hide this layer, like hide everything that's red or something like that. So you can make up your own meanings for these colors, and it's a pretty handy option for just categorizing your work, basically. Another thing you might want to do with your layers is to right click on the square that displays the thumbnail of your layer, and to set these things here like small thumbnails and clip thumbnails to layer bounds, which will make it so that this little display here displays exactly the content of your layer and nothing, not the space around it. So you can exactly see what the layer is. I actually found out about this in the last video I made. I've been using Photoshop for like years, and I never realized that I could turn this thing on. It's much nicer. I'll show you what that is in a second, like how it looks in practice. But let's go to the toolbar here and select the pencil tool. And that's the tool you're going to be using to draw sprites and pixel art in general. And let's select black. And now that our pencil is selected, you might just want to check that the opacity is set to 100. And we can adjust the size of our brush by pressing Alt and right click, holding those buttons, and then just moving your mouse left and right. This is a quick way to do it. You can also bring up the menu by doing right click, and now you have these options here, but we don't want to do that. We can just quickly change the size of our brush, and let's make a nice round circle. As you can see, the circle is very, as you would say, pixelated. The edges are very rough and precise. Every edge is just a precise makeup of pixels. There is no smoothing, and we want to keep it that way, because if you were to use a brush tool, this would be the result. So let's make a circle. So you can see the difference here. Basically, when you use the pencil, you get these blocks which are precise pixels filled with color. And by using the brush, it also depends on the type of the brush which you use. But for example, I've selected this default hard round. You can also use a softer one. And what it does is basically they automatically apply feathering and anti-aliasing around your target pixel so that it looks smoother. But we don't want to do that because it produces a lot of these half transparent, non-crisp pixels on the side, like this stuff here. And this is generally unwanted in pixel art, and you want to get rid of all such pixels. And in that regard, we're just gonna avoid using the brush tool for now. It's very useful and it can be used for a lot of great things, but that will come in a later video. For now, I just want you to use the pencil. Okay, I've erased all those circles because I want to just explain the difference between brush and pencil. And now we're gonna draw something that looks maybe like a blade. So I'm gonna show you this process quickly, and there is a few tricks that you're gonna pick up here already about Photoshop. So if I want to make a straight line, I can just click somewhere where I want the line to begin, and now hold Shift and click somewhere else, and it's gonna create a straight line from point A to point B. However, I missed, like this pixel here should have been the target so that it can be exactly straight, and that's fine now. And now, instead of trying to match it again, we could just duplicate this here, and we can use the selection tool for that. We can select things with multiple tools. There are 4 tools here and also 3 tools here. This one lets you select things in a rectangular area, which is a standard way to select stuff. However, you might want to make use of this lasso tool or the polygonal lasso tool. So what this does is basically lets you draw what you want to select. So you can just draw an area which you want to select, and now it's selected. And so it doesn't matter that it shows that all of this stuff here is selected because there's nothing in it. So if I copy my current selection, it's just going to copy these black pixels. It's not going to copy anything else because there's nothing there. So how you can duplicate this is actually pretty handy as well. You can go to the Move tool, and your current selection will be duplicated if you hold Alt and just left click and move it somewhere else. Now the original stays in place, but I've created a new duplicate. But now you have these black pixels still selected, and you don't want to keep your selection active because while something is selected, other things which are outside of the selection cannot be edited. So you want to deselect the current selection, and you can do that by pressing Ctrl D or by clicking elsewhere with a selection tool. So I can go back to the marquee tool here and just click somewhere like here, and it's gone. Or you can just press Ctrl D and it will do the same thing. Anyway, we're gonna move the blade a little bit here to the corner, and now we can create a hilt. You can also use your arrow keys to move your selected layer by a 1 pixel measure in any direction which you press. However, sometimes it's useful. I use this. You can also hold Shift and then do your arrow keys, and it will move it by 10 pixels in a direction. Sometimes you might want to move things a little bit more than just 1 pixel, you know. And but if you need to move it by some larger extent, then you can just drag your layer. Basically, it's the quickest way to do it, I think. And now we're gonna take the bucket tool again, and we want to make sure that we have opacity set to 100 and we have anti-alias turned off because we don't want it to try to smoothen out the pixels around our target area. And we want to turn contiguous on because contiguous is going to fill basically all the pixels within an enclosure, and it's not going to go outside of it. So our black pixels here represent an enclosure, and if I paint with the bucket with some color inside, okay, let me just close this area off as well. Now we can do something like that, and let's make a brownish hilt. Okay. All right. So another question is, how do I quickly change colors, and how do I set up my colors so that I can use them quickly instead of always picking things around this color wheel, and most importantly to keep consistency, because if I just knew that I wanted to use this brown but now I want to use white, now I want to use the same brown again, how am I sure that I'm going to click on the same thing? Like I could move it here by a little and it's already going to be a different color. Maybe not too visible to the eye, but nevertheless, it's going to be a different color. We want to minimize the amount of colors we use, and we want to use them consistently. So we need to create a color palette, and Photoshop already has a tool for that, which you can find by going to Window and Color. And now we can go to Swatches, and we can basically build our color palette here. We can create new swatches by clicking this button. However, you can explore these tabs inside of this window here. There's a bunch of useful stuff that you might want to play with. It all relates to how you select and use your colors, but another approach that I would probably recommend better is to screw that and to just implement your colors directly inside of your canvas on the side on a different layer, so you can later delete them when you no longer use them. But the reason why I do that is because I make heavy use of this eyedropper tool. This tool lets you select something, and it will pick up the color of the pixel on which you clicked. So if I click on this brown here, as you can see here, the brown changed a bit, and I can click on here or here, and you can see on the side that it's picking up those colors which I'm clicking on, which is extremely useful. So if I have my colors here, for example, this is what I would do. Basically, you can build your color palette on the side and then just stick to using these values basically by using the eyedropper tool. And a quick way to use that tool is to just hold Alt while you have your pencil selected, and as you can see, the cursor is going to turn to this eyedropper thingy, and then just click on something and release, and you're back to using the pencil. So you can just quickly pick these colors up. Oops, I fucked up. So you can quickly pick these colors up by the eyedropper tool, and just when you're no longer using them, make sure to move them to a separate layer. For example, I'm currently drawing the sword on the same layer where I drew the colors, and I don't want that. So I'm going to use the lasso tool to select them and right click and layer via cut. And what this will do is just cut out from the current layer whatever you have selected. And this will also be very useful in many occasions for you. And now you know how to do that as well. And now the color palette is in a different layer. I'm not exactly sure if that's how you spell that, but who cares? And now that everything is set up, you can just use what I taught you to quickly draw here and, place colors from your color palette onto the sprite. I'm not going to go into creating this whole sprite now. I'm not here to, do art right now. I just want to show you how to use Photoshop. So let's say you start applying this highlight here, and you are a beginner, you are not sure if it's going to turn out all right. And if it doesn't, you don't want your attempt to ruin the sprite. You don't want to find yourself clicking the undo button like 50 times. By the way, this will save your life right now when I mentioned it. Go to Edit, Preferences, and Performance. And here you can modify how many times you are able to undo, basically how much it remembers about your history in your document. So the higher you put this history states value, the more times you are able to press undo, basically. And usually I think this comes by default set to 10 or 20. When you're doing pixel art, you tend to do a lot of moves. So even placing one pixel at a time somewhere, it counts as a single move. And if you place like 10 or 20 pixels, that's going to blow up your entire history state with just your placements of these single pixels. And you tend to do a lot more when you're creating a sprite. So you want to be able to comfortably go back all the way back in time and set this value to a number that you're comfortable having your history count to. So I'm comfortable with 50. If I do a mistake that requires me to rewind time by 50 or more moves, then I've really messed up. And I think 50 is enough. Of course, the more you increase these numbers, the more memory you're gonna need for Photoshop to run. So make sure that you have enough RAM for this. Usually it shouldn't take much, but take note. Anyway, as I was saying, so you don't want to find yourself pressing the undo button 50 times. What you might want to do is create a new layer. So let's create a new layer and then paint the highlights on top of them, right? And turns out I don't like this, and I want to delete just the stuff that I just did. I can just disable or delete this layer completely by selecting it, pressing delete, or you can drag it here to this garbage can icon here. But you can also use the eraser tool, but it will only erase from that layer. So the eraser only erases on the current layer, like the pencil only draws on the current layer. And now I have it selected here from this menu, eraser tool. Make sure that the mode is set to pencil, not brush. Opacity is 100%, and now we can erase. So two very important shortcuts for these two very useful and most commonly used tools, which are the pen. You might want to memorize that. It's B, and for the eraser, it's E. So B is because the brush is like the main tool here. So B for brush, but we're using the pencil. And you can, of course, change that in your preferences, like I said. So you can go B pencil and E eraser. And now this is going to look much more fluid when you're working. So as long as you remember B, E, and Alt. Alt for the color picker. And now you can just quickly work without paying mind to non-stop having to select stuff from those menus. Basically, as you can see, this thing goes pretty fast. Like when you get those shortcuts right, you can save yourself a lot of time, like clicking through the menus and everything. So that will be it about drawing and using Photoshop for these basic things. Before we move on to finalizing this, I would like to mention a few more things. And one of these things is this very useful tool here called the Magic Wand tool. Maybe it's not selected by default. You want to bring it up from this menu. Click on it. Now, this tool allows you to click on a pixel on your current selected layer, and it will select automatically all other pixels which are same or similar to the pixel you selected in terms of its color. So if I click anywhere on this brightest area, it's going to select all of the brightest pixels. And then we can add to that selection by holding Shift. And now there's a little plus sign next to our cursor. And that means we are adding to our current selection. So this is selected and we add this. We can add this. And now we have effectively selected everything that's inside of our blade. And if we want to do something with it now, we could. So we could select the move tool and move this somewhere, or we could, while we have a selection tool applied, for example, this magic wand tool, we can right click and go to layer via cut or layer via copy. And this will make a new layer by cutting out the current selection from its current layer, or we can create a new copy of the selection in a new layer. And as you can see, now I did that. And if I hide the sword, we have the blade in a new layer as well, a copy of it. But the blade is still intact on the original one. So if I did the cut thing, then the blade would be cut from here. This can be very useful in many, this can be very useful in many different situations. So you might want to keep that in the back of your mind that you're able to actually do this if you need to crop things out of like a huge sprite or something like that. So the last thing I want to show you is how to save your work and save it as a transparent single image, or how to save single images, like single sprites, out of an entire grid of sprites which may be located in a single huge image. We should first disable the background so that it doesn't get saved alongside our sword. And now we can go to File, Save As, and just make sure that you save it as a PNG file, not Photoshop or JPEG. So you want to save your project when you're working on something in the PSD format, which is the Photoshop format that preserves all the details about your project inside of it. So let's first do that actually. Let's save it as Sword Project. Okay. Now, if I close this and go to my desktop, I can see the project is here and double click on it. It will open it in Photoshop. And once again, everything is here. Our layers are here, our layer markings, everything basically that you did in your project is back to how it was before you saved it. So that's a format that you definitely want to be using. But when you want to save it as an image, you want to pick a different format from here and you want to go with PNG. And I will explain why in a moment when I explain the next thing that I want to show you. So let's just save this. And you want to pick smallest file size because you always want your images to be small. It will take more time to save the image On small images, you're not gonna notice this difference, but on larger images, yeah, it tends to do like 10 or 15 seconds, but it doesn't matter. Like you want to save as the smallest image possible, because if it's ever displayed anywhere in a game or on a website, you want to save your users the pain of loading images of a large size. So the faster, the better. And there it is. Our sword is right there. Let's go back and do this for multiple swords in a single image. So first things first, let's create a little bit larger canvas. So I'm going to resize this current canvas that I have and make it larger so we can fit, I don't know, 5 or 6 swords or something like that. So let's go to image and canvas size. You don't want to do image size, because when you do that, for example, let's increase that, it's going to increase our entire image. And by the way, this blurring, this is what Photoshop does to try to kind of keep the quality of your image intact while resizing it. So when you reduce the size of your image or increase it, it's going to apply some of these effects and algorithms to try to keep things smooth. But in trying to make a very small and pixelated image larger, it tends to do a lot of this blur. So if you want to keep your original crispness and make sure that none of these effects are getting applied, you can change the sample method. And instead of using big cubic sharper, we can go to nearest neighbor, hard edges. And when you do that, it's going to, oops, I didn't change the size. So let's go and increase that. It's going to keep it much like the original, basically. And if I try to paint on this, you can see that this is actually now much larger. This used to be 1 pixel. Now it's like 4 times. So let me go back. So undo. And now we're back to the original size. And I wanted to increase the canvas size, not the image size. So this is just going to make the area in which we can work with larger and make the image larger, but not the content of the current image. So it's just going to make the space huge. And let's do 128. And now you can see we have a lot of empty space. We're going to disable the background for now. All right. So now I want to have a bunch of swords here, like this, basically. And I have drawn 10 different swords inside of this huge canvas. Now, how do I make sure that they all align perfectly? How do I export all of them from within this image without having to cut them out of here and paste them into a new file and then save that file? Let's find out. So first things first, you might want to make yourself a grid, and that way you will be able to see the size of each cell clearly and see how much space each of your sprites occupy. And now we can go to Edit, Preferences, Guides, Grid, and Slices. And then we can modify the size of our grid here. I've set it to 32 pixels, so each cell in the grid is going to be 32 by 32. You might want to change this to something else depending on the size of your sprites which you work with. I work with 32 by 32 for most of the time, so I'm using that. And now we can press OK and go to View, Show, Grid. And now we can see a grid. It's not very visible because the background makes it so, but if we turn on this background and I'm gonna quickly make this a little bit larger. Yeah, you can see it more clearly now. You can modify the color as well. I'm using this lime green. I'm used to it, but you might find it too bright or annoying. In that case, just set yourself something different up. Okay, let me delete all of this. Now that we have the grid, we can, let's say, duplicate our sword a few times. And just to make them a little bit different for purposes of demonstration, I'm gonna just quickly go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, which is Control U. And open this window and just change this value here. I'm not gonna explain what this does currently, but as you can see on the screen, it's basically changing the colors of the layer. You can play around with that. And now I got a bunch of like different swords, right? And I want to export all of them into their respective 32 by 32 image. So we might want to slice this, carve this canvas up like a cake. And for that, we're going to use a slice tool, which you can find here. And you want to create your first slice. And this entire slice is going to be the size of our whole image. And now what you can do, you can see here in the corner, there's like this little blue rectangle that tells you that this is slice number 1. So this entire image is basically a single slice. Right click inside of that slice and go to divide slice. And now we can choose how to divide it. And we want to divide it into 32 by 32 pixels per slice. And as you can see, now our image is sliced up into segments which are appropriate to our wanted sprite size, basically. And we can go to File, Export, Save for Web. And in this window, we can choose which slices we want to export as images. So let's zoom in here. And we can hold Shift and now click on each slice which we want to include. Okay, and now make sure that this preset is set to PNG 24. The reason we want to use PNG is because PNG is the highest quality format. Basically, you can use it, preserves all the details about your sprite, and it doesn't apply any sort of compression, which would reduce the quality or reduce the crispness of our sprite. But furthermore, and probably most important, PNG supports transparency, which means that we can have our sword without any background behind it. If you save this as a JPEG or something like that, it would automatically make a background behind it. And you don't want to do that. You want to save it without one. So let's make sure that PNG is selected and transparency is enabled. And now we can go to save. And here where it says slices, you want to make sure that you have selected slices picked and not all slices. This will come by default. And if you do that, it's just going to export everything, including all these empty ones. We don't want that. We just want the ones we selected. So let's say selected, and let's save it to desktop. And I'm not going to change the name. I'm just going to leave the name like it is. And if I go to my desktop now, I can see that there's a new folder called images. So Photoshop automatically creates this. And inside of this folder called images, we can see that all of our sprites are now in their own image, basically. And that's very useful when you're working with larger tile sets and things like that. And that's it. Hopefully, you'll learn something and you can already start working with Photoshop using these tips and tricks. And in the next video I make on this topic, which I don't know when I will do, I will try to cover some more advanced techniques and some more useful tools. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you're confused about or something you're interested in. I'm always there to answer questions and just help you out, so don't be shy. Yeah, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.